Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight's topic sounds dramatic, but the title is not exaggerating. We are examining 10 pieces of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythology that would destroy your sanity, or, more precisely, 10 ideas embedded in his fictional universe that challenge the assumptions most people quietly carry about reality. Readers often approach H.P. Lovecraft expecting monsters, tentacles, ancient cults, perhaps a few strange books whispered about in dusty libraries. Those elements exist, certainly. Yet they are not the true source of dread. The deeper disturbance comes from something more intellectual. The suggestion that humanity's understanding of existence may be profoundly incomplete. Lovecraft constructed his stories as if they were fragments of research rather than conventional fiction. Newspaper clippings appear beside academic notes. Archaeological reports sit beside terrified testimonies. Each document seems small on its own. Together, they imply something vast, something ancient, something indifferent. Consider this carefully. The horror in these tales does not come from violence. It comes from discovery. What happens when a scholar realizes Earth was inhabited long before humanity? What happens when language fails to describe what exists beyond human perception? And what happens when knowledge itself becomes psychologically dangerous? In this investigation, we will examine 10 forms of forbidden knowledge scattered across the mythos, ideas involving alien history, cosmic indifference, hidden dimensions, and the unsettling possibility that humanity is not the central story of the universe. We begin where Lovecraft himself began, with the intellectual climate that made such ideas imaginable. Readers often approach the forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythology as if it emerged from pure imagination. That assumption collapses quickly when we examine the intellectual climate surrounding H.P. Lovecraft during the early 20th century. Lovecraft was writing in a moment when scientific discovery was rapidly expanding the perceived scale of the universe. The comfortable 19th century belief in a stable, comprehensible cosmos was already weakening. Astronomy was revealing galaxies beyond the Milky Way. Physics was rewriting the structure of matter. Anthropology was uncovering civilizations far older than European historical traditions had assumed. These developments produced a subtle philosophical shock. Humanity was no longer the central observer in a tidy creation. Instead, the species appeared increasingly small, recent, and contingent. Lovecraft recognized the narrative potential of that realization. The horror in his fiction therefore emerges not from supernatural intrusion, but from the logical implications of modern knowledge. Consider the historical timeline. Lovecraft was born in 1890, a period when Victorian confidence in human progress still dominated Western thought. By the time he began publishing widely in the 1920s, several intellectual revolutions had already unsettled that worldview. Albert Einstein's work on relativity, introduced in 1905 and expanded in 1915, reshaped scientific understanding of space and time. Meanwhile, advances in astrophysics suggested that the universe contained billions of galaxies rather than a single cosmic system centered on Earth. Even earlier, Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory had removed humanity from any privileged biological position. These discoveries did not simply change scientific textbooks, they changed cultural imagination. Lovecraft absorbed these developments intensely. His letters repeatedly describe a universe governed by impersonal forces, one that operates without moral direction or human significance. Such ideas form the philosophical foundation of cosmic horror. Lovecraft himself framed this philosophy with unusual clarity. in a letter written in 1927, he explained that the deepest form of fear arises from recognizing humanity's fragile position within an indifferent cosmos. The phrase often quoted from his essay, Supernatural Horror, in literature, captures this sentiment precisely. Humanity, he suggested, exists on a placid island of ignorance. The danger comes when that island erodes. Notice the structure of this concept. The threat is not invasion, but revelation. Knowledge itself becomes destabilizing. A forgotten archaeological inscription, a fragment of alien geometry, or a cryptic manuscript can suddenly widen the scale of reality. What once seemed stable becomes provisional. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's method. His stories are structured as investigations, not confrontations. Characters rarely defeat the unknown. Instead, they document it, often reluctantly. We must pause here to consider the intellectual elegance of that choice. Traditional Gothic fiction typically centers on moral conflict, the struggle between virtue and corruption, faith and temptation, innocence and monstrosity. Lovecraft abandons that framework entirely. The terror he describes is not moral, but cosmological. Human ethics become irrelevant in a universe billions of years old. The ancient entities described in the mythos are not villains in the conventional sense. They represent natural forces operating on a scale beyond human comprehension. This distinction matters enormously. The stories therefore examine existential instability rather than supernatural evil. A reader encountering these narratives gradually recognizes that humanity occupies only a temporary position in cosmic history. Comparisons with earlier writers clarify Lovecraft's innovation. Edgar Allan Poe had already explored psychological dread in the 19th century, emphasizing unstable perception and unreliable narration. Meanwhile, Arthur Machen introduced the idea that ancient, hidden civilizations might exist beneath modern society. Lovecraft combined both influences while expanding the scale dramatically. Machen suggested forgotten pagan survivals within rural landscapes. Lovecraft extended that idea outward to geological and cosmic time. The result was a mythology spanning millions of years, involving alien civilizations that predate humanity entirely. The shift is subtle but decisive. Horror becomes not the intrusion of evil into the familiar world, but the realization that the familiar world was never central to begin with. Lovecraft reinforced this philosophical framework through a distinctive narrative strategy. His protagonists are usually scholars, antiquarians, geologists, linguists, archaeologists, or professors. These figures approach mysteries through research rather than superstition. Documents accumulate. Evidence builds gradually. Scientific reasoning becomes the very mechanism that reveals cosmic insignificance. Consider this carefully. In most horror traditions, science protects humanity from the unknown. In Lovecraft's stories, science dismantles humanity's comforting illusions. Discovery becomes dangerous. Curiosity becomes psychologically hazardous. The very traits associated with intellectual progress begin to undermine the stability of human identity. The consequence of this narrative approach is the emergence of what scholars now call cosmicism, a philosophical outlook emphasizing the insignificance of human concerns within a vast and indifferent universe. Lovecraft did not invent this worldview entirely, but he translated it into narrative form with unusual consistency. His fictional texts, cult fragments, and archaeological discoveries all point toward the same unsettling conclusion. Humanity occupies a minor position in cosmic history. Other intelligences existed long before our species evolved. those intelligences may return, or they may simply continue ignoring humanity entirely. And this realization brings us directly to the deeper question behind the mythos. If cosmic horror emerges from modern scientific awareness, why does it often resemble ancient mythology? Why do Lovecraft's entities appear within languages, symbols, and rituals that feel older than recorded history? To answer that question, we must look further back, into the cultural and philosophical traditions that shaped humanity's earliest attempts to imagine the unknown. If Lovecraft's cosmic horror appears radically modern, its deeper roots extend much further into intellectual history. The unsettling ideas embedded within his mythology did not arise in isolation. They evolved from older philosophical traditions, mythological structures, and literary experiments that already questioned humanity's central position in the universe. Lovecraft recognized these precedents clearly. He studied ancient mythologies, 19th century philosophy, and earlier Gothic literature with unusual intensity. The result was a fictional cosmology that feels simultaneously ancient and modern. Not a mythology invented from nothing, but one assembled from fragments of earlier cultural anxieties. Ancient civilizations had long imagined forces beyond human control. Consider Mesopotamian cosmology, which described primordial beings existing before the formation of the ordered world. In the Babylonian creation narrative, Enuma Elish, the chaotic entity Tiamat precedes the structured universe established by later gods. Greek mythology presents a similar structure. Primordial forces such as Chaos, Nyx, and Tartarus exist before the Olympian pantheon imposes order. These early traditions depict existence emerging from vast and indifferent forces. Lovecraft did not copy these myths directly. Instead, he amplified their underlying suggestion that order is temporary and fragile. In the mythos, humanity inherits a planet already shaped by entities older than civilization itself. The philosophical dimension of this idea intensified during the 19th century. European thinkers increasingly questioned the belief that human life possessed inherent cosmic significance. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the early 1800s, described the universe as driven by an impersonal force he called the will. Human consciousness, in his view, was simply a localized expression of this broader phenomenon, meaning therefore becomes unstable. A few decades later, Friedrich Nietzsche pushed this destabilization further by arguing that traditional moral frameworks were historical constructions rather than eternal truths. Both thinkers contributed to a growing intellectual atmosphere of existential uncertainty. Lovecraft encountered these ideas indirectly through popular philosophical commentary and absorbed their implications into narrative form. Literary influences were equally important. Gothic writers in the 19th century had already begun exploring the psychological consequences of encountering incomprehensible realities. Edgar Allan Poe examined the fragility of perception, particularly in stories where narrators struggle to interpret disturbing phenomena. Poe's horror emerges from uncertainty. The reader cannot determine whether events are supernatural or psychological. Later authors expanded this ambiguity. The Welsh writer Arthur Machen, publishing in the 1890s, introduced the disturbing possibility that remnants of ancient civilizations might persist beneath modern society. Machen's story, The Great God Pan, suggests that hidden realities may exist just outside the limits of human perception. Lovecraft admired this concept deeply. He transformed Machen's hidden pagan survivals into something far older and more cosmic. This reveals something essential about Lovecraft's method. He rarely invents ideas outright. Instead, he expands them to unsettling proportions. Machen proposed forgotten beings hidden in remote landscapes. Lovecraft suggested entire alien civilizations buried beneath geological strata. Earlier Gothic literature focused on haunted castles or cursed families. Lovecraft relocated horror into deep time and astronomical space. The transformation changes everything. The threat is no longer confined to a particular place. It becomes structural, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Another important influence emerged from anthropology during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars studying ancient cultures often described mythological systems that appeared startlingly alien to modern readers. Rituals, cosmologies, and symbolic languages from distant civilizations challenged Western assumptions about universal human beliefs. Lovecraft followed these developments closely. Anthropological reports convinced him that human cultures have always produced radically different understandings of reality. If human societies can imagine such divergent cosmologies, then perhaps humanity's current worldview is merely another temporary framework. We must pause here to consider the narrative consequences of this realization. Lovecraft's fictional mythos frequently presents fragments of knowledge preserved across cultures and centuries. Ancient tablets discovered in deserts, forgotten cult rituals, or obscure manuscripts in remote libraries all contain pieces of a much older story. These fragments appear disconnected at first. Only gradually do characters recognize their shared implication. Human civilizations, despite their differences, may have inherited faint memories of entities that once dominated Earth. This structure mirrors real historical scholarship, where researchers reconstruct lost cultures from scattered evidence. Lovecraft's approach also benefits from a strategic ambiguity. The stories rarely confirm whether ancient myths describe literal events or symbolic interpretations of incomprehensible phenomena. Are the mythological entities described in various traditions truly the same beings appearing in the mythos? Or are they distorted human attempts to understand something entirely different? Lovecraft leaves the question unresolved. That uncertainty sustains the sense of intellectual dread. Knowledge remains incomplete, fragmented, always just beyond full comprehension. Another cultural element deserves attention: the language of forbidden texts. Ancient traditions frequently warned that certain knowledge should remain hidden. Religious scriptures, mystical treatises, and philosophical manuscripts often describe dangerous revelations accessible only to initiates. Lovecraft adapts this motif with remarkable consistency. His fictional universe contains numerous forbidden books, scholarly translations, and cryptic inscriptions. These texts function simultaneously as narrative devices and philosophical symbols. They represent the human desire to understand the universe and the psychological cost of achieving that understanding. Consider this carefully. The cultural traditions shaping Lovecraft's mythology already suggested that knowledge could be dangerous. What Lovecraft added was scale. The forbidden knowledge in his stories does not merely threaten individual morality or social order. It threatens humanity's entire conceptual framework. Discovering the truth about the universe may render human history, religion, and philosophy insignificant. This escalation prepares us for a crucial component of Lovecraft's myth-building strategy: language itself. The names of entities, the symbols etched into forgotten ruins, and the strange phonetics of alien tongues all reinforce the idea that human vocabulary struggles to describe cosmic realities. Understanding that linguistic strategy requires closer examination, which leads naturally into the next stage of our investigation. One of the most distinctive features of Lovecraft's mythology lies in its language. Readers encountering the mythos for the first time often notice the strange names. Immediately, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep. These words resist comfortable pronunciation. They appear foreign even to experienced readers. This effect is deliberate. Lovecraft understood that language shapes perception. When a name feels linguistically alien, the concept behind it begins to feel alien as well. The unfamiliar phonetics create a subtle psychological barrier, suggesting that the realities described in the stories originate outside human experience. Lovecraft described this strategy explicitly in several letters during the 1920s. He argued that truly alien entities should not possess names that fit comfortably within European linguistic patterns. Human languages evolved to describe human environments. When applied to non-human phenomena, they inevitably fail. Lovecraft, therefore, designed names that appear partially pronounceable, but never entirely stable. Readers disagree about how to vocalize them. This uncertainty becomes part of the narrative, experience. The entities themselves remain conceptually unstable, hovering just beyond precise definition. Consider the name Cthulhu. Lovecraft explained that it approximates a sound produced by an alien physiology rather than a human mouth. Readers attempt to pronounce it using familiar phonetic rules, yet none of those attempts fully satisfy. The result reinforces the central philosophical theme of cosmic horror. Human frameworks are inadequate for describing the wider universe. This reveals something important. The unsettling quality of these names comes not from complexity, but from displacement. They resemble language without belonging entirely to any known linguistic system. The symbolic languages appearing throughout the mythos deepen this effect. Lovecraft frequently describes inscriptions carved into stone ruins, metallic tablets, or ancient monoliths. These markings often combine geometric shapes with unfamiliar characters. They appear structured, even systematic. Yet, scholars within the stories struggle to interpret them. The implication is that the symbols represent conceptual systems beyond human cognition. Archaeologists recognize patterns but cannot fully translate their meaning. Each fragment suggests a larger grammar that remains permanently incomplete. Lovecraft occasionally names these fictional languages directly. One example is Aklo, a supposedly ancient tongue used by cultists and certain non-human beings. Another is the strange script associated with the submerged city of Relaya. The texts carved into that city are said to reflect a non-Euclidean understanding of space. Such descriptions may sound abstract, but they perform a specific narrative function. They suggest that alien civilizations possess intellectual structures fundamentally different from human reasoning. Their languages encode realities that human grammar cannot easily represent. We must pause here to consider the relationship between language and knowledge. In human history, language acts as the primary tool for organizing thought. Scientific discoveries become meaningful only when described through shared vocabulary. Philosophical ideas spread through written discourse. Lovecraft's fictional languages challenge that assumption. They imply that certain truths may exist outside the limits of human expression. When characters encounter these alien scripts, translation becomes dangerous. Each deciphered phrase reveals another layer of unsettling implication. Historical context strengthens this idea. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars were actively deciphering ancient languages such as Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. These discoveries revealed entire civilizations previously unknown to modern history. Lovecraft followed these developments closely. If forgotten languages could reshape our understanding of the past, what might happen if an even older script described events predating humanity entirely? This possibility transforms linguistic scholarship into a source of existential dread. Lovecraft also draws subtle inspiration from real esoteric traditions. Medieval and Renaissance scholars often believed certain languages possessed mystical properties. Hebrew, Greek, and various symbolic alphabets were sometimes thought to encode sacred or hidden truths. Lovecraft adapts this idea while removing its religious certainty. In his stories, language does not reveal divine order. Instead, it exposes cosmic indifference. The symbols carved into alien ruins describe astronomical cycles, interstellar migrations, and entities older than the Earth itself. Knowledge expands outward until human meaning collapses. Comparisons with earlier literary traditions help clarify the innovation. Gothic writers frequently used mysterious manuscripts as plot devices. A discovered letter or journal might explain a haunting or reveal a family curse. Lovecraft expands that device dramatically. His manuscripts do not resolve mysteries, they deepen them. Each translation opens additional questions. The more characters learn, the less stable their worldview becomes. The documents accumulate like archaeological layers, hinting at a history far older than human civilization. Another linguistic feature deserves attention: Lovecraft's use of partial description. Characters often report that certain words cannot be fully reproduced in human writing. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu, for example, struggles to record the exact sounds associated with alien chants. Scholars transcribe approximations rather than precise representations. This technique preserves the sense that something essential remains outside the narrative. Language approaches the truth without capturing it completely. Consider this carefully. Cosmic horror depends on maintaining a gap between description and reality. If the unknown were fully explained, it would become familiar. Lovecraft's linguistic strategies prevent that closure. The reader encounters fragments, names, symbols, chants, translations, but never a complete system. The mythos, therefore, feels vast and unfinished, like a field of study whose central theory remains just out of reach. These linguistic fragments also serve another purpose. They create the illusion of historical depth. A strange name implies a cultural context. A symbolic script suggests a lost civilization. Each invented language therefore functions as archaeological evidence within the narrative world. By the time readers encounter the more famous forbidden texts of the mythos, they already accept the idea that hidden intellectual traditions might exist. And those texts, manuscripts attributed to ancient scholars, occult historians, and forgotten civilizations, form the backbone of Lovecraft's fictional scholarship. Understanding how those documents create an illusion of authenticity leads directly into the next stage of our investigation. Lovecraft's mythology feels strangely convincing, even when readers recognize its fictional nature. This effect does not emerge from elaborate world-building alone. It comes from the way Lovecraft presents information. His stories often read less like conventional horror narratives and more like historical investigations. Reports accumulate, sources appear, fragments of testimony intersect with academic speculation. The reader begins to feel as if they are examining evidence rather than fiction. This narrative strategy creates a powerful illusion. The mythos appears to exist within a hidden layer of scholarly documentation. The most famous example of this technique is the Necronomicon, a fictional manuscript attributed to the so-called Mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. Lovecraft introduces this book gradually across multiple stories during the 1920s, allowing it to function as a recurring scholarly reference rather than a single plot device. Characters cite the text cautiously, usually within academic contexts, libraries, universities, private collections. The Necronomicon is rarely quoted directly. Instead, its contents are described in summaries, translations, or footnotes. This restraint proves essential. By withholding full passages, Lovecraft allows readers to imagine the disturbing implications themselves. Consider the structural effect of such a text within the narrative world. A fictional book becomes more believable when treated as a historical artifact. Lovecraft frequently provides publication histories, translation dates, and custodial locations. The Necronomicon, for example, supposedly originated in the 8th century, was translated into Greek during the 11th century, and later rendered into Latin in 1228. These chronological details resemble genuine bibliographic scholarship. The reader encounters the text through the same mechanisms that historians use to reconstruct real manuscripts. Authenticity emerges through documentation rather than direct exposition. Lovecraft expands this strategy by introducing multiple fictional sources. The Necronomicon appears alongside other texts such as De Vermis Mysteries, the Pennacotic manuscripts, and the Culte des Goules. Each work carries its own historical background, authorial attribution, and scholarly reputation. Some texts are rumored to exist only in private collections. Others appear in obscure academic libraries. Together, they form a fragmented archive of forbidden knowledge. The documents rarely agree entirely with one another. Contradictions appear. Interpretations differ. This fragmentation strengthens the illusion that the mythos represents a genuine field of study rather than a single invented narrative. We must pause here to recognize how carefully this technique mirrors real academic practice. Historians often reconstruct the past using incomplete evidence. Letters, inscriptions, marginal notes, secondhand reports. Lovecraft adapts this method to fictional material. Characters behave like researchers attempting to assemble a coherent picture from scattered sources. The process becomes unsettling precisely because it resembles legitimate scholarship. Each discovery appears plausible within the intellectual frameworks readers already recognize. Another narrative device reinforces this sense of realism: the use of layered documentation. Many Lovecraft stories unfold through multiple levels of testimony. A narrator might quote a professor's report, which itself references a diary, which contains a transcription of an even older manuscript. The famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, demonstrates this structure clearly. The narrative unfolds through academic notes, newspaper clippings, and eyewitness accounts gathered by an investigating scholar. Each document contributes a fragment of information. Only near the end does the narrator realize that these fragments describe the same ancient phenomenon. This technique produces what literary scholars often call pseudo-anthropological realism. Lovecraft frames supernatural events within the language of anthropology, archaeology, and comparative mythology. Cult rituals are described as ethnographic observations. Alien ruins are analyzed using geological terminology. The tone remains calm and scholarly, even as the implications grow disturbing. The result is a peculiar blend of academic detachment and existential dread. The reader senses that the narrator is attempting to remain rational while confronting evidence that destabilizes rational explanation. Lovecraft's collaborative circle of writers further strengthened this illusion of authenticity. Authors such as Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard occasionally reference the same fictional texts and entities within their own stories. These cross-references created the impression of a shared scholarly tradition extending across multiple narratives. The mythos, therefore, evolved into something resembling an academic discipline. Different authors contributed new manuscripts, historical interpretations, and cosmological theories. Readers encountered these works as if they were examining competing research perspectives. Consider the psychological effect of this method. Horror often depends on emotional immediacy. Dark corridors, sudden apparitions, desperate escape. Lovecraft deliberately avoids those conventions. His narrators usually remain distant observers, analyzing documents and artifacts with professional restraint. The dread emerges gradually as evidence accumulates. A fragmentary inscription suggests ancient worship. A translated passage hints at extraterrestrial visitors. A geological survey reveals structures older than human civilization. Each detail appears harmless alone. Together, they imply something profoundly unsettling. This reveals the deeper logic of Lovecraft's myth-building. The mythos does not function as a single story. It operates as a research archive filled with incomplete records. Readers become investigators, piecing together scattered clues about entities that predate humanity itself. Knowledge spreads through libraries, letters, translations, and archaeological discoveries. The horror lies in recognizing that these documents may describe a coherent reality hidden beneath ordinary history. And that recognition brings us to the philosophical heart of Lovecraft's universe. If such knowledge exists, if alien civilizations once shaped Earth, if ancient texts preserve fragments of their history, what does that imply about humanity's place in the cosmos? To answer that question, we must move beyond historical influences and examine the deeper ideas embedded within the mythos itself. The next section, therefore, turns toward the philosophical themes that give Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge its disturbing power. Readers encountering Lovecraft's mythology often focus first on the creatures, the great old ones, the outer gods, the alien cities beneath oceans, or buried beneath polar ice. These elements dominate popular imagination. Yet, the deeper structure of the mythos rests on ideas rather than monsters. The stories repeatedly circle around several philosophical propositions about the nature of existence. These propositions appear simple at first glance. Humanity is small. Time is vast. Reality may extend beyond ordinary perception. But Lovecraft develops these ideas with unusual consistency across his fiction and essays. Each narrative, therefore, functions as a kind of philosophical experiment. What would happen, he asks implicitly, if these propositions were not metaphors, but literal truths? The first concept is cosmic insignificance. Human cultures traditionally assume that the universe exists within a meaningful framework centered on humanity. Religious traditions often place human consciousness near the center of creation. Even secular philosophies tend to assume that human experience remains the primary reference point for meaning. Lovecraft dismantles that assumption. In his stories, humanity occupies a minor position within an immense cosmic ecosystem. Alien civilizations existed millions of years before humans evolved. Other intelligences travel through space without noticing Earth at all. Consider the quiet terror of this suggestion. The universe does not hate humanity. It simply does not care. A line frequently quoted from Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, expresses this perspective directly. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Yet the mythos expands that unknown dramatically. The danger lies not merely in what humanity has not discovered, but in what discovery might reveal. If the universe is indifferent, human history becomes a brief episode within a much longer cosmic narrative. Lovecraft repeatedly illustrates this idea through archaeological discoveries. Ruins appear beneath deserts, polar ice, or ocean trenches, structures constructed long before the earliest human civilizations. Closely connected to insignificance is the concept of entropy. Lovecraft absorbed scientific discussions about thermodynamics and cosmic decay that circulated widely during the late 19th century. Physicists were increasingly discussing the heat death of the universe, the theoretical state in which energy distribution becomes uniform and no organized structure can persist. Lovecraft transforms this abstract scientific idea into narrative atmosphere. His fictional universe feels ancient, worn, almost exhausted. Civilizations rise, flourish briefly, and collapse beneath geological time. The alien elder things described in At the Mountains of Madness illustrate this pattern clearly. Their once vast civilization slowly deteriorates as environmental conditions change and biological experiments escape their control. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's interpretation of history. Human progress appears temporary rather than inevitable. Ancient alien cultures once mastered technologies far beyond human science, yet they also declined. Entropy operates universally. Not gods, but systems subject to decay. The mythos, therefore, presents existence as an ongoing cycle of emergence and dissolution. Cosmic forces produce complex structures for a time, then reclaim them. Humanity participates in this cycle without understanding it. Another philosophical concept emerges through Lovecraft's exploration of dream reality. Several stories suggest that dreams may connect human consciousness with alternate dimensions or hidden layers of existence. The so-called dreamlands, described in tales such as The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, appear as a parallel reality accessible through sleep. At first glance, this idea resembles traditional fantasy literature. Yet Lovecraft introduces a disturbing twist. Dreams do not simply create imaginary worlds. They may function as gateways to places that exist independently of human perception. We must pause here to examine the implications of that idea. If dreams allow access to other dimensions, then the boundary between subjective experience and external reality becomes unstable. Characters traveling through the dreamlands encounter cities, beings, and landscapes that possess their own histories. These environments obey different physical laws. Time flows irregularly. Geography shifts according to unfamiliar principles. The traveler therefore becomes an accidental explorer in a cosmological system far larger than waking reality. Lovecraft occasionally hints that certain entities move freely between dream and waking worlds. One such figure is Nyarlathotep, a messenger-like presence who appears in both realms. Unlike other cosmic entities, Nyarlathotep seems strangely interested in human affairs. His appearances often involve strange exhibitions of knowledge or technology that destabilize ordinary perception. Yet even here, Lovecraft avoids clear explanations. The character may represent a bridge between dimensions, or simply an observer from a higher cosmic hierarchy. The relationship between dreams and cosmic knowledge becomes especially unsettling when combined with the earlier themes of insignificance and entropy. Dreams may reveal truths that human consciousness cannot comfortably process while awake. Characters who travel too deeply into these dream realms often return with fragmented memories and profound psychological distress. They glimpse cosmic structures that contradict the assumptions of ordinary life. What begins as curiosity becomes epistemological crisis. Consider this carefully. The mythos repeatedly suggests that reality operates on multiple scales simultaneously. Human perception captures only a narrow band of that complexity. Beyond it lie astronomical processes, ancient civilizations, and dimensions accessible only through altered states of consciousness. The forbidden. Knowledge scattered throughout Lovecraft's stories therefore functions as a set of conceptual keys. Each discovery unlocks another layer of the cosmic structure. Yet these discoveries rarely produce empowerment. Instead, they reveal a universe governed by forces that dwarf human understanding. Insignificance, entropy, dream reality. Three philosophical elements forming the conceptual foundation of cosmic horror. The book speaks of cycles, of alignments, of gateways between worlds. Humanity exists somewhere within those cycles, but never at their center. And once these philosophical ideas take shape, another question naturally follows. If the universe contains such immense forces, what kinds of beings might inhabit it? The mythos answers that question cautiously, introducing entities whose existence reflects the same unsettling cosmic scale. When readers first encounter Lovecraft's mythology, attention naturally shifts toward the entities that inhabit this immense and unsettling universe. These beings, often called the Great Old Ones or the Outer Gods, appear repeatedly across different stories. Yet Lovecraft presents them in a way that differs sharply from traditional mythological deities. Ancient religions usually describe gods with personalities, rivalries, and recognizable motivations. Lovecraft rejects that structure almost entirely. The entities of the mythos rarely behave like characters. They resemble forces or phenomena, operating according to principles far removed from human morality. This distinction matters enormously. The Great Old Ones are not villains plotting against humanity. They represent older forms of existence that simply occupy the same universe. Humanity enters their sphere accidentally. A helpful comparison comes from environmental science. Humans often destroy microscopic ecosystems without noticing. Lovecraft reverses that perspective. Humanity becomes the small and fragile organism, living briefly within a planetary environment, shaped by far older intelligences. The dread emerges from scale rather than hostility. Consider the Outer Gods, a category of entities positioned at the most distant level of Lovecraft's cosmology. These beings appear less like individuals and more like cosmic principles. Among them is Azathoth, described in several stories as a blind, chaotic presence at the center of the universe. Lovecraft's descriptions emphasize disorder and constant motion. Azathoth is surrounded by flutes and chaotic rhythms, a strange detail that suggests the universe itself may operate like a kind of cosmic vibration. The image is unsettling. Reality appears less like a carefully constructed system, and more like an unstable process unfolding without purpose. Another major figure within this cosmic hierarchy is Yog-Sothoth. Lovecraft describes this entity as existing simultaneously across all points of space and time. The phrase often associated with Yog-Sothoth appears in the story The Dunwich Horror. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Such language may sound mystical, yet its implications are philosophical. Yog-Sothoth represents the idea that space and time might form a unified structure, accessible to higher forms of consciousness. Human perception, limited by biological constraints, cannot easily comprehend that structure. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's cosmology. The mythos entities embody conceptual ideas rather than narrative personalities. Azathoth reflects cosmic chaos. Yog-Sothoth reflects the interconnected structure of space-time. Others represent still different aspects of the universe. These figures function almost like metaphors made literal. They allow Lovecraft to explore philosophical questions through narrative symbolism. At a slightly lower level in the hierarchy appear the Great Old Ones. These entities interact more directly with planetary environments, particularly Earth. The most famous example is Cthulhu, introduced in the story The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928. According to the narrative, Cthulhu once ruled Earth alongside other ancient beings before geological changes forced them into dormancy. The creature now lies in a submerged city called Relaya beneath the Pacific Ocean. Lovecraft's description emphasizes scale and alien geometry. The city's architecture appears non-Euclidean, suggesting structures that defy ordinary spatial logic. Why describe architecture in such terms? Lovecraft uses geometry as a narrative signal that the physical laws governing alien civilizations may differ from those experienced by humans. When explorers encounter these ruins, their perception begins to falter. Angles appear impossible. Distances behave unpredictably. The environment itself destabilizes human cognition. The Great Old Ones therefore function not merely as biological organisms, but as representatives of different physical realities. We must pause here to examine the role of time within this hierarchy. Many mythos entities appear ancient beyond ordinary comprehension. Their histories extend millions of years into the past, often predating the emergence of complex life on Earth. Lovecraft repeatedly references prehistoric epochs to reinforce this scale. The implication is unsettling. Human civilization represents a recent and temporary development within a much longer planetary history. Ancient beings once shaped Earth's ecosystems, built cities, and conducted experiments long before human ancestors evolved. Another category of beings complicates this cosmology further: intermediary figures that interact more frequently with humanity. One example is Nyarlathotep, a mysterious entity appearing across multiple stories. Unlike most cosmic beings in the mythos, Nyarlathotep displays curiosity about human affairs. He often manifests in human-like form, presenting strange technologies or cryptic revelations to unsuspecting audiences. This behavior distinguishes him sharply from other entities. The outer gods remain distant and indifferent. Nyarlathotep engages directly, almost experimentally. Such interactions often lead to cult formation within Lovecraft's narratives. Humans encountering fragments of cosmic knowledge sometimes begin worshiping these entities as gods. Yet the worship rarely benefits humanity. Cultists misinterpret cosmic forces through familiar religious frameworks. They assume intention where none exists. The entities themselves remain largely unconcerned with these rituals. Human devotion becomes another example of anthropocentric misunderstanding. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's entities challenge the idea that intelligence must resemble human consciousness. These beings may possess awareness, but their motivations operate on scales beyond human psychology. Their goals, if they possess goals at all, may unfold across millions of years. Human lifetimes therefore become insignificant intervals within broader cosmic processes. The mythos hierarchy can thus be understood as a layered structure. At the highest level exist the outer gods, representing fundamental cosmic forces. Beneath them appear the Great Old Ones, ancient beings tied more directly to planetary environments. Intermediary figures move between these levels, occasionally interacting with human civilization. The structure resembles an ecological system more than a divine pantheon. Entities occupy different niches within the cosmic environment. This cosmology raises a troubling question. If such beings exist within the universe, what happens when humans encounter evidence of them? Lovecraft's stories repeatedly explore that moment of confrontation. The result is rarely enlightenment. More often, it produces confusion, terror, or psychological collapse. Understanding why that happens requires examining the human mind itself and how it responds when confronted with realities that exceed its conceptual limits. Lovecraft's stories rarely depict humanity confronting cosmic entities through open conflict. Battles, heroic victories, and triumphant discoveries appear surprisingly rare across the mythos. Instead, the most common human response to forbidden knowledge is psychological collapse. Characters uncover fragments of cosmic truth and gradually lose their ability to interpret the world coherently. This narrative pattern appears so consistently that scholars often refer to it as the madness function within Lovecraft's fiction. Madness in these stories does not represent weakness or moral failure. It represents a cognitive reaction to information that the human mind cannot comfortably integrate. The pattern unfolds gradually. Lovecraft typically introduces characters who begin as rational investigators. Professors, geologists, linguists, and archaeologists populate the mythos with notable frequency. Their professional training encourages curiosity when they encounter strange artifacts or unusual historical records. They pursue explanation through scholarly methods. Documents are translated, fossils are examined, ruins are mapped. The process appears entirely rational at first. Only later does the investigation reveal something unsettling. The evidence points toward a history that contradicts humanity's assumptions about the universe. Consider the structure of Lovecraft's famous investigative narratives. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator assembles fragments of information left behind by a deceased professor. Newspaper clippings describe strange cult rituals occurring in distant regions. A sculptor records disturbing dreams involving alien cities rising from the sea. A Norwegian sailor reports encountering a monstrous entity after discovering a sunken island. Each document appears isolated. The narrator initially treats them as unrelated curiosities. Gradually, however, the pieces align into a disturbing pattern. Humanity may be sharing the planet with entities older than civilization itself. We must pause here to examine the psychological consequence of such discoveries. The problem is not fear alone. Humans encounter frightening situations frequently without losing their sanity. Lovecraft's characters experience something deeper, conceptual destabilization. The frameworks they use to interpret reality suddenly fail. History, biology, and cosmology no longer align with familiar explanations. When a scholar realizes that human civilization occupies a tiny interval within a much older cosmic timeline, the meaning of cultural progress begins to erode. Lovecraft occasionally describes this process explicitly. In At the Mountains of Madness, an Antarctic expedition uncovers fossilized remains belonging to a prehistoric alien species known as the Elder Things. Geological evidence indicates that these beings constructed vast cities millions of years before human evolution. Murals inside the ruins depict biological experiments conducted by the aliens, experiments that may have influenced the emergence of life on Earth. The implication proves devastating for the human investigators. Humanity may not represent the pinnacle of evolution after all. It may simply be a secondary outcome of earlier extraterrestrial experimentation. The psychological stages of discovery follow a recognizable sequence. First comes curiosity. Scholars examine artifacts or manuscripts with intellectual excitement. Next appears unease, often triggered by inconsistencies between the new evidence and established scientific models. As more data accumulates, fascination gives way to dread. The investigator begins recognizing the scale of the implication. Finally comes collapse. The mind struggles to reconcile its previous worldview with the newly revealed cosmic structure. Lovecraft reinforces this progression through narrative tone. His protagonists rarely scream or panic immediately. Instead, they describe growing intellectual discomfort. Notes become erratic. Letters grow increasingly fragmented. Eventually, the narrator may abandon the investigation entirely, convinced that further knowledge would prove psychologically destructive. The horror, therefore, emerges through documentation rather than dramatic confrontation. Madness becomes visible through deteriorating scholarship. Comparisons with earlier Gothic traditions help clarify Lovecraft's innovation. Gothic characters often descend into madness because of supernatural curses, emotional trauma, or moral guilt. Lovecraft removes those elements almost entirely. His characters go mad because they understand too much. Knowledge becomes the catalyst. The human brain evolved to interpret environments relevant to survival on Earth. When confronted with realities spanning millions of years or multiple dimensions, those cognitive mechanisms break down. Consider this carefully. The madness function operates as a philosophical argument embedded within narrative. Lovecraft suggests that certain truths might exceed the adaptive limits of human cognition. Our mental architecture evolved to navigate forests, oceans, and social relationships. It did not evolve to comprehend cosmic timescales or multidimensional physics. When characters encounter such information, their minds attempt to interpret it using inadequate conceptual tools. The resulting contradictions produce psychological strain. Lovecraft's fictional scholars sometimes attempt to protect humanity from this knowledge. In several stories, investigators deliberately conceal evidence rather than publish their findings. They fear that widespread awareness of cosmic insignificance could destabilize civilization itself. The implication remains ambiguous. Would humanity truly collapse if confronted with such truths? Lovecraft never answers directly. He prefers to leave the possibility suspended between speculation and dread. Another narrative detail strengthens this ambiguity. Not every character reacts identically to forbidden knowledge. Some individuals join cults devoted to cosmic entities, interpreting the revelations as religious awakening rather than intellectual crisis. Others retreat into isolation, dedicating their lives to studying the mythos in secret. A few even attempt communication with alien beings, hoping to obtain deeper understanding. These varied responses suggest that madness is not the only possible outcome, though it remains the most common. The madness function therefore serves two purposes within Lovecraft's philosophy. It dramatizes the psychological cost of cosmic discovery, and it preserves mystery within the mythos. If investigators could interpret forbidden knowledge calmly, the stories would eventually produce clear explanations. Madness interrupts that process. Documents remain incomplete. Translations stop abruptly. Witnesses refuse to describe what they have seen. And that interruption leads directly to the most unsettling element of Lovecraft's mythology, the idea that certain knowledge might be fundamentally incompatible with human understanding. At the center of Lovecraft's mythology lies a disturbing proposition. Knowledge itself can become dangerous. Many horror traditions involve forbidden objects or cursed places. Lovecraft shifts the focus toward information. The threat arises when humans uncover truths that destabilize the intellectual foundations of their civilization. This idea appears repeatedly across mythos narratives. Manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, and scientific investigations reveal fragments of cosmic history. Each revelation expands the scale of reality until the human perspective begins to collapse under its own limitations. Lovecraft frames this problem in epistemological terms, though the stories rarely use academic vocabulary directly. Epistemology concerns the nature and limits of knowledge, how humans know what they know. The mythos suggests that human cognition evolved within narrow environmental boundaries. Our ancestors developed mental models capable of interpreting forests, rivers, predators, and social groups. Those models proved sufficient for survival. Yet they were never designed to comprehend astronomical timescales or multidimensional geometries. When characters encounter evidence of such phenomena, their intellectual frameworks begin to fracture. One of the most famous symbols of forbidden knowledge within the mythos is the Necronomicon, the fictional manuscript attributed to the mysterious scholar Abdul al-Hazred. Lovecraft introduces this book gradually across several stories written during the 1920s. Scholars treat it as an obscure historical text, usually stored in restricted sections of university libraries. The Necronomicon supposedly records ancient observations of cosmic entities and describes rituals capable of contacting them. Yet, the book is rarely quoted directly. Instead, characters summarize passages cautiously, often with visible anxiety. The implication becomes clear. The text contains information that should not circulate freely. The structure of these manuscripts deserves closer attention. Forbidden texts in the mythos rarely present complete explanations. They appear fragmented, translated imperfectly from older languages, or preserved in damaged copies. Scholars interpret them cautiously, aware that even partial comprehension can produce unsettling conclusions. Consider the cumulative effect of such fragments. A translated phrase suggests that alien beings once ruled Earth before humanity emerged. Another passage describes gateways between dimensions. A third implies that certain alignments of stars may allow those entities to return. None of these statements proves definitive on its own. Together, they form a pattern that challenges humanity's entire historical narrative. We must pause here to consider the philosophical implications of such discoveries. Human civilizations rely on shared explanations of the universe. Scientific theories, religious traditions, and historical narratives provide conceptual stability. These frameworks allow societies to organize knowledge coherently. Forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythology disrupts that stability. When investigators discover that humanity may occupy a minor position within a vast cosmic system, previously reliable explanations begin to lose authority. Lovecraft often dramatizes this collapse through scholarly characters who confront overwhelming evidence. In several stories, investigators attempt to publish their findings, only to hesitate once they understand the consequences. If humanity learned that Earth once hosted alien civilizations millions of years ago, how would existing scientific institutions respond? Would religious traditions reinterpret their doctrines? Would governments attempt to conceal the information? Lovecraft rarely answers such questions directly. Instead, he leaves them suspended, inviting readers to consider the fragility of intellectual consensus. A striking example appears in the narrative structure of The Whisperer in Darkness, published in 1931. The story describes a correspondence between a university professor and a reclusive scholar living in rural Vermont. The letters gradually reveal evidence of extraterrestrial beings known as the MyGo. These creatures supposedly travel between planets and collect human brains for study. At first, the professor treats the claims as folklore. As additional evidence appears, strange footprints, mechanical devices, intercepted messages, his skepticism begins to erode. The reader witnesses epistemic collapse in real time. Scientific reasoning, normally a stabilizing force, begins supporting increasingly disturbing conclusions. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge does not rely on supernatural explanations alone. It frequently emerges from scientific observation. Fossils, astronomical alignments, and geological formations provide empirical evidence for cosmic events. The unsettling realization is that rational inquiry itself may uncover truths incompatible with human psychological stability. Knowledge expands outward until the observer confronts realities too vast to assimilate comfortably. Another feature of epistemic collapse appears in the mythos through the gradual erosion of disciplinary boundaries. Modern knowledge systems divide expertise into separate fields: astronomy, biology, linguistics, archaeology. Lovecraft's investigations repeatedly cross those boundaries. An ancient inscription might contain astronomical references. A geological formation may reveal biological structures. Linguistic analysis uncovers historical records of extraterrestrial migrations. The resulting synthesis produces conclusions that no single discipline anticipated. Human knowledge becomes interconnected in ways that destabilize traditional categories. Lovecraft occasionally hints that certain scholars continue studying these forbidden truths despite the psychological risk. Secret societies, hidden libraries, and isolated researchers appear throughout the mythos. These individuals pursue knowledge not because it promises power, but because curiosity proves irresistible. They recognize the danger, yet continue reading ancient manuscripts or exploring alien ruins. The pursuit resembles scientific obsession taken to its logical extreme. This reveals something profound about the relationship between knowledge and curiosity. Human progress depends on investigation. Yet Lovecraft suggests that investigation may eventually encounter limits beyond which understanding becomes destructive. The universe might contain truths that human cognition cannot integrate without severe psychological cost. The forbidden knowledge scattered throughout the mythos therefore functions as both narrative device and philosophical warning. Each manuscript, inscription, or scientific discovery acts as a conceptual doorway. Once opened, the door cannot easily be closed. Investigators glimpse a universe operating according to principles that dwarf human concerns, and those glimpses lead naturally into the literary dimension of the mythos itself. The ideas explored in these philosophical sections did not remain abstract theories. Lovecraft embedded them within specific stories, narratives where scholars, explorers, and investigators encounter fragments of cosmic truth. Understanding how these themes manifest within individual works requires turning to the earliest literary appearances of the mythos. To understand how forbidden knowledge operates within Lovecraft's mythology, we must begin with the earliest stories where the system first takes shape. These narratives did not appear as a fully developed universe from the beginning. Instead, the mythos emerged gradually across several works published between 1921 and 1931. Each story introduced fragments of a larger cosmology: ancient, cities, forbidden texts. alien beings without presenting a complete explanation. Readers therefore encounter the mythos as scholars encounter historical evidence, scattered across different sources, partially preserved, and occasionally contradictory. One of the earliest and most significant examples appears in The Nameless City, written in 1921. The story follows an explorer traveling through an ancient desert ruin buried beneath shifting sands. At first, the discovery appears archaeological rather than supernatural. The narrator examines murals carved into stone walls depicting reptilian creatures inhabiting a city long before human civilization. These murals show a disturbing progression. The creatures flourish, build vast architecture, and eventually vanish. The narrator writes that the murals suggested a history written in stone long before the dawn of mankind. This line performs a crucial narrative function. It introduces the idea that Earth possesses a pre-human history involving intelligent beings. Consider the structure of this revelation. Lovecraft does not present the ancient creatures directly. Instead, the narrator reconstructs their existence through artistic records. The reader, therefore, experiences the discovery intellectually rather than visually. Archaeological evidence becomes the medium of horror. The story ends with the narrator fleeing underground tunnels after glimpsing something moving in the darkness. Lovecraft never describes the creature fully. The implication remains deliberately incomplete. Something ancient still exists beneath the ruins. The mythos expands dramatically a few years later in The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928. This story introduces one of the central entities of Lovecraft's cosmology, Cthulhu. The narrative unfolds through a collection of documents discovered by the narrator after the death of his grand uncle, a professor of Semitic languages. These materials include newspaper clippings, sculptures, and a Norwegian sailor's testimony describing a monstrous encounter at sea. One passage summarizes the terrifying realization emerging from these documents. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We must pause here to examine that statement carefully. It functions as a philosophical thesis embedded within the story itself. The horror does not lie only in the existence of Cthulhu. The horror lies in the recognition that human knowledge remains fragmented. If humanity were able to correlate every piece of evidence, every cult ritual, every dream, every archaeological discovery, the resulting picture would prove unbearable. Lovecraft therefore frames ignorance as a psychological defense mechanism. The narrative also introduces an important mythological element, the submerged city of R'lyeh. According to the sailor's testimony, the city briefly rises from the ocean during a strange alignment of stars. Sacht, architecture appears impossible, composed of angles that distort perception. The sailors who land there encounter a colossal creature emerging from a stone doorway. Lovecraft describes the being using deliberately incomplete imagery. A mountain walked or stumbled. Such phrasing avoids detailed anatomical description. The reader perceives the entity through metaphor rather than precise imagery. This technique reveals Lovecraft's narrative philosophy. Cosmic horror thrives on implication. If the creature were described with biological precision, it would become familiar. By leaving the description ambiguous, Lovecraft preserves the sense that human language cannot fully capture what the sailors witnessed. Another important development appears in The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929. This story introduces the cosmic entity Yog-Sothoth, whose nature differs significantly from Cthulhu. Yog-Sothoth does not inhabit a hidden city, or ancient ruin. Instead, the story describes it as existing beyond ordinary space and time. One famous line from the narrative states, "Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate." The statement sounds mystical, yet it reflects a deeper cosmological concept. Yog-Sothoth represents the interconnected structure of the universe itself. The narrative centers on a rural Massachusetts family attempting to open a gateway between dimensions. The protagonist, Professor Armitage, eventually discovers that the monstrous entity terrorizing the countryside is only partially visible within human reality. The creature exists simultaneously in multiple dimensions. This concept expands the mythos beyond planetary history into metaphysical territory. The universe may contain layers inaccessible to human perception. We must also recognize how these stories connect with one another through recurring artifacts. The Necronomicon appears repeatedly across different narratives, often consulted by scholars attempting to interpret strange phenomena. By referencing the same manuscript in separate works, Lovecraft creates continuity between otherwise independent stories. The reader gradually recognizes that each narrative contributes a fragment of a larger cosmological puzzle. Another subtle connection emerges through shared themes of archaeology and scholarship. Characters rarely discover cosmic entities by accident. Instead, they uncover evidence through research, examining inscriptions, studying ancient languages, or comparing historical records. This scholarly approach reinforces the illusion that the mythos represents a hidden field of study rather than a series of isolated supernatural events. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's earliest stories function like preliminary case studies within a larger investigation. Each narrative introduces a new category of evidence. Desert ruins reveal ancient civilizations. Cult rituals reveal ongoing worship. Manuscripts reveal forbidden knowledge preserved across centuries. By the time readers encounter later stories, the mythos already possesses a network of historical references. And this network becomes even more elaborate when Lovecraft begins exploring individual narratives in greater depth. Certain stories expand beyond fragmentary hints into detailed explorations of cosmic discovery. The next section, therefore, examines one of the most influential examples, a narrative where forbidden knowledge emerges through a carefully constructed investigative structure. Among all the narratives that shaped Lovecraft's mythology, the Call of Cthulhu remains the most influential early example of cosmic horror in action. Published in 1928, the story demonstrates how Lovecraft translates philosophical ideas, insignificance, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic scale into a carefully structured narrative investigation. Rather than presenting a straightforward encounter with a monster, Lovecraft constructs the story as a scholarly reconstruction. The narrator assembles evidence left behind by his deceased granduncle, Professor George Angel. These materials include archaeological reports, police records, personal diaries, and a sailor's testimony. Each document appears mundane on its own. Together, they imply a disturbing global pattern. The investigation begins with a small and seemingly harmless artifact, a clay bas-relief sculpture created by a young artist named Henry Wilcox. The sculpture depicts a strange creature with wings, tentacles, and a vaguely humanoid outline. Wilcox claims that he sculpted the figure after experiencing recurring dreams of a massive city rising from the ocean. Professor Angel immediately recognizes something unusual. Similar descriptions appear in anthropological reports concerning a secret cult operating in remote regions of the world. The cult chants a phrase that appears repeatedly throughout the story. Funglui Mlwanaf Cthulhu Relie Gahnagel Fetagen. Translations vary, but scholars within the story suggest it roughly means, in his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Consider the narrative strategy Lovecraft employs here. The creature does not appear immediately. Instead, its existence emerges gradually through documentary evidence. Police reports describe cult ceremonies in Louisiana swamps. Anthropologists record similar myths among Pacific Island cultures. The same symbol, the winged, tentacled figure, appears across multiple continents. Lovecraft therefore introduces the mythos through comparative anthropology. The reader begins to suspect that ancient beliefs preserved across different cultures may share a common origin. We must pause here to examine the significance of that method. Mythology often spreads through cultural exchange or coincidence. Lovecraft deliberately blurs the line between those explanations. Are these cult traditions independent interpretations of a universal archetype? Or do they represent distorted memories of something historically real? The story never resolves the question completely. Instead, it allows evidence to accumulate until coincidence becomes difficult to sustain. The final document within Professor Angel's archive provides the most dramatic revelation. It comes from a Norwegian sailor named Gustav Johansen, who survived a strange maritime encounter in the South Pacific. According to his account, an earthquake caused a previously submerged island to rise briefly from the ocean. The sailors land on this island and discover an enormous city composed of strange geometric structures. Lovecraft's description of the architecture emphasizes spatial distortion. The geometry of the place was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. This passage performs several narrative functions simultaneously. First, it introduces the idea that alien civilizations may construct environments governed by unfamiliar physical laws. Second, it destabilizes the reader's spatial imagination. Non-Euclidean geometry implies structures that cannot exist within ordinary three-dimensional space. The city therefore becomes an architectural manifestation of cosmic difference. Johansen's testimony culminates in the appearance of Cthulhu itself. The sailors accidentally open a massive stone doorway, releasing the creature from its long dormancy. Lovecraft avoids precise anatomical description, instead relying on scale and metaphor. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. The sailors panic and flee. One attempts to ram the creature with a ship, temporarily dispersing its physical form before it reforms again. The survivors escape, though only Johansen lives long enough to record the event. Consider this carefully. The narrative does not conclude with victory or resolution. The creature remains alive, merely returning to its submerged city. The narrator recognizes that the stars will eventually align again, allowing Cthulhu to awaken fully. The story therefore ends with a chilling implication rather than a completed conflict. Humanity has glimpsed a fragment of cosmic history, but cannot change its outcome. Another striking feature of the story lies in its philosophical framing. The narrator ultimately decides not to publish his findings widely. He fears that revealing the truth about Cthulhu and the ancient cults would destabilize society. The line mentioned earlier, the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, returns here as a final reflection. Knowledge may exist, but the human mind may not be equipped to process it safely. This narrative structure illustrates Lovecraft's central concept of epistemic danger. Each piece of evidence appears manageable individually, A strange sculpture can be dismissed as artistic imagination. A cult ritual might be interpreted as local superstition. A sailor's testimony may be considered unreliable. Yet when these elements align, the implications expand beyond ordinary explanation. The reader experiences the same gradual recognition as the narrator. The story also establishes a template that Lovecraft would use repeatedly in later works. Investigative structure, fragmented documentation, and global mythological connections all appear here for the first time in fully developed form. The mythos begins to resemble an academic discipline rather than a single fictional narrative. And yet the call of Cthulhu represents only one expression of cosmic discovery within Lovecraft's universe. Other stories push the implications even further by examining ancient alien civilizations directly. One of the most powerful examples appears in a later narrative set in the most remote environment on Earth, Antarctica. If the call of Cthulhu introduces the mythos through scattered evidence, At the Mountains of Madness reveals the implications of that evidence with startling clarity. Written in 1931 and published in 1936, the story presents Lovecraft's most detailed exploration of cosmic archaeology. Instead of isolated cult rituals or mysterious manuscripts, the narrative centers on a full scientific expedition to Antarctica. The protagonists are geologists and biologists working for Miskatonic University, conducting legitimate research in one of the least explored regions of Earth. This setting matters enormously. Antarctica already occupies a symbolic place in human imagination, a vast, remote landscape where unknown discoveries still seem plausible. The narrator, Professor William Dyer, frames the entire story as a warning. From the opening paragraphs, he insists that future expeditions must avoid certain regions of the Antarctic interior. The reason becomes clear only gradually. During their exploration, the scientists discover a mountain range far larger than any previously recorded. The peaks appear strangely regular, rising from the ice in unnatural formations. Dyer notes that their scale evokes something unsettling, structures built according to a design older than human history. The expedition's initial discovery appears biological rather than architectural. Drilling through deep layers of ice, the scientists uncover fossilized organisms unlike any known life form. These specimens possess radial symmetry, strange membranous appendages, and complex anatomical structures that resemble both plant and animal characteristics. Lovecraft describes them carefully, almost clinically. At first, the researchers treat the discovery as an extraordinary paleontological breakthrough. Only later do they realize the fossils show signs of surgical alteration. The creatures appear not merely biological, but engineered. Consider the shift that occurs here. The scientists begin with familiar categories: biology, geology, paleontology. Gradually, those categories collapse as evidence accumulates. The fossils belong to a race later, identified as the Elder Things, an ancient extraterrestrial species that arrived on Earth millions of years before human evolution. Their civilization flourished across the planet during prehistoric epochs. Lovecraft's narrative suggests that they constructed vast cities, conducted biological experiments, and created artificial life forms to serve as laborers. These artificial organisms, known as Shoggoths, represent one of the most unsettling elements in the story. According to murals discovered inside the ruins, the Elder Things engineered the Shoggoths as shapeless biological machines capable of performing complex tasks. Over time, however, the creatures developed limited autonomy. The murals depict a rebellion in which the Shoggoths overthrow their creators, destroying portions of the alien civilization. Lovecraft describes this moment in deliberately restrained language. The murals show scenes of chaos, destruction, and strange organic forms absorbing their masters. We must pause here to consider the narrative function of these murals. They transform the story from simple exploration into historical reconstruction. The scientists become archaeologists of an alien civilization. Each carving reveals another chapter of forgotten planetary history. One panel depicts the elder things arriving from space in cylindrical vessels. Another shows them constructing cities across the ancient continents. A third illustrates their biological experiments, including the creation of primitive life forms that eventually evolved into Earth's ecosystems. The implication becomes unavoidable. Humanity may be the indirect result of extraterrestrial experimentation. Lovecraft never states this conclusion explicitly, but the evidence strongly suggests it. The mural sequences indicate that the elder things seeded Earth with biological organisms designed to serve their needs. Over millions of years, those organisms evolved into complex ecosystems. Humanity therefore occupies a position within a much older chain of biological development. Another passage in the story emphasizes the vast scale of this timeline. The narrator observes that the alien city predates the earliest known fossils of human ancestors. The architecture itself appears ancient beyond comprehension, eroded by geological processes lasting tens of millions of years. Lovecraft writes that the explorers realized they were walking through a city older than the oldest myths of man. The line captures the essence of cosmic horror. Human civilization, often treated as the pinnacle of historical development, suddenly appears brief and fragile. The exploration eventually leads the scientists deeper into the city's underground tunnels. There they discover evidence that some of the elder things survived long after their civilization declined. Certain chambers contain preserved specimens that appear to have been revived by accidental warming during the expedition's drilling operations. The explorers also encounter signs that Shoggoths still inhabit the lower levels of the ruins. Lovecraft describes these creatures with unusual restraint, emphasizing their amorphous structure and shifting surfaces. The scientists glimpse them only briefly before retreating in terror. Consider this carefully. The horror in At the Mountains of Madness does not come from direct confrontation with monsters. It emerges from historical realization. The scientists reconstruct an entire planetary narrative that contradicts humanity's assumptions about its place in the universe. Earth was once a colony of extraterrestrial beings. Their civilization flourished and declined long before human history began. The ruins beneath the Antarctic ice represent a lost epoch of cosmic development. The story also expands the mythos beyond Earth itself. The murals depict distant planets, strange astronomical alignments, and migrations across interstellar space. The elder things did not originate on Earth. They arrived here from elsewhere. Their civilization, therefore, forms part of a much larger cosmic network. Humanity occupies only a small corner of that network, largely unaware of its existence. Lovecraft concludes the narrative with an image of lingering uncertainty. As the surviving explorers flee the ruins, they glimpse something vast moving through the underground tunnels, a surviving Shoggoth, echoing the ancient rebellion depicted in the murals. The creature's presence suggests that remnants of the prehistoric world still survive beneath the Antarctic ice, and that lingering presence reinforces a central theme of the mythos. Ancient forces may remain dormant, but never entirely disappear. Later writers within Lovecraft's circle would expand this idea further, transforming the scattered hints of the original stories into a broader, shared mythology. Lovecraft's mythology did not remain confined to his own stories. Even during his lifetime, fragments of the mythos began appearing in the works of friends and correspondents who shared his fascination with cosmic horror. This literary collaboration occurred informally through letters, shared manuscripts, and pulp magazine publications during the 1920s and 1930s. Lovecraft encouraged other writers to reference his fictional texts, entities, and historical fragments. The result was unusual for its time. A loosely coordinated fictional universe built across multiple authors rather than controlled by a single creator. One of the earliest collaborators was Clark Ashton Smith, whose stories frequently explored alien civilizations and forbidden knowledge. Smith contributed new locations and cosmic entities to the emerging mythology, often emphasizing the immense age of the universe. His tales describe forgotten continents, ancient magical sciences, and alien cultures existing alongside early human civilizations. Smith's prose style differed significantly from Lovecraft's. While Lovecraft favored scholarly detachment, Smith leaned toward lush imagery and decadent atmosphere. Yet the philosophical foundation remained consistent. Human history unfolds within a much larger cosmic framework. Another key contributor was Robert E. Howard, best known today for creating the character Conan the Barbarian. Howard's stories occasionally reference mythos elements such as ancient tomes and cosmic entities. In Howard's fictional history, remnants of alien knowledge survive in lost civilizations predating recorded history. This integration allowed the mythos to extend backward into prehistoric eras. Howard's stories, therefore, complement Lovecraft's cosmic archaeology by exploring earlier phases of human interaction with forbidden knowledge. Consider the unusual literary environment in which these collaborations occurred. Pulp magazines such as Weird Tales publish short fiction for readers interested in supernatural and speculative themes. Authors frequently corresponded with one another through letters, discussing ideas and sharing narrative elements. Lovecraft encouraged this practice openly. In several letters written during the 1930s, he expressed enthusiasm for the idea that fictional concepts could circulate freely between authors. Rather than protecting the mythos as personal intellectual property, he treated it as a shared mythological framework. We must pause here to recognize how unusual this approach was for its time. Modern audiences are familiar with shared fictional universes in film franchises or comic book series. Lovecraft and his contemporaries developed a similar structure decades earlier, though without centralized planning. Each author introduced new manuscripts, cult traditions, or cosmic beings, expanding the mythology organically. Readers encountered recurring references across different stories and gradually recognized the connections. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos entered a new phase of development through the work of August Derleth. Derleth admired Lovecraft deeply and became one of the primary editors responsible for preserving his work. He co-founded Arkham House, a publishing company dedicated to printing Lovecraft's stories in book form. Without this effort, many of the original tales might have remained scattered across old pulp magazines. Derleth also contributed his own mythos stories. His interpretation introduced a significant conceptual shift. Lovecraft's original cosmology emphasized cosmic indifference. The alien entities were not moral forces, but natural phenomena operating beyond human concerns. Derleth reorganized these beings into a more traditional structure, resembling mythological pantheons. He divided them into elemental categories: air, water, earth, and fire, and introduced opposing forces representing good and evil. This reinterpretation made the mythos more accessible to readers familiar with conventional fantasy structures. The change remains controversial among scholars. Some critics argue that Derleth's framework simplifies Lovecraft's philosophy. Cosmic horror loses part of its unsettling power when the universe begins resembling a moral battlefield. Lovecraft's original vision suggested that humanity occupies a universe without inherent ethical structure. Derleth's version reintroduces familiar patterns of conflict between benevolent and malevolent powers. Yet Derleth's influence also ensured the survival and expansion of the mythos. Through Arkham House publications beginning in 1939, Lovecraft's stories reached a broader audience than they had during his lifetime. New writers encountered the mythology and began contributing additional interpretations. Over time, the mythos evolved into an extensive network of stories, novels, games, and speculative essays exploring the same cosmic framework. Consider this carefully. Mythologies rarely remain static. Ancient religious traditions changed as new generations adapted them to different cultural contexts. The mythos followed a similar path. Lovecraft provided the foundational cosmology, ancient alien civilizations, forbidden texts, and cosmic indifference. Later writers experimented with these elements, sometimes preserving the original philosophy, sometimes modifying it to suit new narrative goals. Another important development occurred through fictional scholarship. Writers within the mythos tradition occasionally produced entire passages from forbidden books that Lovecraft himself had only mentioned briefly. The Necronomicon, for example, inspired several attempts at partial reconstruction by later authors. These texts expanded the mythology's historical background while maintaining the illusion that such manuscripts existed within a hidden intellectual tradition. This collaborative process ultimately transformed the mythos into something resembling a cultural phenomenon rather than a single literary project. Stories written decades apart continued referencing the same cosmic entities and ancient texts. Readers began treating the mythos almost like a body of folklore, interpreting different versions of the narrative in the same way scholars study evolving mythological traditions. And this evolution raises an intriguing question. What happens when fictional mythology begins influencing real culture? When readers treat invented texts and cosmic entities as if they belong to genuine historical traditions? The answer lies in the cultural afterlife of Lovecraft's ideas, where myth, fiction, and speculation begin to blur in fascinating ways. Something unusual happened after Lovecraft's stories began circulating widely during the 20th century. Readers did not treat the mythos merely as fiction. Some began to speculate, half seriously, sometimes fully convinced, that fragments of the mythology might correspond to real historical mysteries. The most famous example involves the supposed existence of the Necronomicon. Lovecraft repeatedly described this book as an ancient manuscript written by the mysterious scholar Abdul al-Hazred during the 8th century. Libraries, he suggested, preserved rare copies in restricted collections. Readers encountering these details occasionally assumed the text must exist somewhere outside the stories. Consider the persistence of this belief. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, bookstores received letters from readers asking where they could obtain a translation of the Necronomicon. Librarians reported similar inquiries, The requests came from people who understood Lovecraft's stories as fiction, but suspected that the author might have borrowed a genuine occult text as inspiration. Lovecraft himself had anticipated this confusion. In several letters written during the 1930s, he clarified that the Necronomicon was entirely imaginary. Yet the repeated references across multiple stories created an impression of historical depth that readers found difficult to dismiss. This phenomenon reveals something important about the power of fictional scholarship. Lovecraft described the Necronomicon using the language of real historical research. He provided publication dates, translators, and specific libraries where copies supposedly existed. Such details mimic genuine bibliographic documentation. When readers encounter that level of specificity, the boundary between fiction and archival reality becomes surprisingly fragile. The mythos begins to resemble a lost intellectual tradition rather than a literary invention. Modern media has amplified this effect dramatically. Internet forums and social platforms frequently circulate claims that certain mythos texts correspond to ancient occult manuscripts. Some writers even attempt to reconstruct the Necronomicon as if it were a genuine historical document. A controversial example appeared in 1977 when a book marketed as the Simon Necronomicon was published. The text blended elements of Mesopotamian mythology with Lovecraftian imagery. Although scholars quickly recognized it as a modern fabrication, the book gained a cult following among readers interested in occult symbolism. We must pause here to examine why such hoaxes persist. The appeal does not lie solely in superstition. Lovecraft's mythology taps into a deeper human fascination with hidden knowledge. Throughout history, people have imagined secret manuscripts preserved by obscure orders or forgotten civilizations. Medieval alchemists searched for lost texts, promising universal wisdom. Renaissance scholars pursued Hermetic writings, believed to contain ancient philosophical insights. Lovecraft adapted this cultural pattern into his fictional cosmology. The mythos, therefore, feels familiar, even while presenting entirely new ideas. Another intriguing development involves modern reinterpretations of Lovecraftian themes through conspiracy culture. Some online communities speculate about ancient extraterrestrial visitors influencing human history. These theories often reference archaeological mysteries such as megalithic structures or unexplained artifacts. While these claims typically originate from pseudo-historical speculation rather than Lovecraft's work directly, the similarities are striking. Both frameworks imagine ancient civilizations possessing knowledge far beyond modern understanding. Consider this carefully. The persistence of these ideas does not necessarily indicate widespread belief in cosmic entities. Instead, it reflects a broader cultural fascination with hidden narratives beneath ordinary history. Lovecraft's mythos functions as a symbolic framework for that fascination. The stories invite readers to imagine that familiar historical timelines conceal deeper layers of reality. Archaeological ruins, forgotten languages, and obscure manuscripts all become potential gateways into alternative interpretations of the past. Popular media has also contributed to this phenomenon by blending fictional mythologies with documentary-style storytelling. Television programs exploring mysterious archaeological sites sometimes employ investigative formats similar to Lovecraft's narrative structure. Experts analyze artifacts, compare historical records, and speculate about unknown civilizations. Even when the conclusions remain speculative, the investigative tone reinforces the idea that hidden knowledge might exist somewhere beyond mainstream scholarship. The internet has amplified this dynamic in unexpected ways. Online communities dedicated to Lovecraft's work often blur the line between literary analysis and playful speculation. Participants discuss fictional manuscripts as if they were rare historical artifacts. Maps of imaginary locations, such as Orlier, circulate alongside real geographical references. This collaborative world-building resembles the earlier mythos tradition in which multiple writers expanded Lovecraft's universe. Another cultural dimension involves the aesthetics of forbidden knowledge. Visual artists frequently depict ancient tomes, cryptic symbols, and hidden archives inspired by Lovecraft's mythology. Video games and tabletop role-playing games incorporate investigative mechanics where players uncover fragments of dangerous information. The process mirrors the experience of Lovecraft's characters. Curiosity leads to discovery. Discovery leads to unsettling realization. Yet the fascination persists because it resonates with universal human questions. What if human history represents only a partial record of the past? What if civilizations existed before recorded history in forms we no longer recognize? What if knowledge itself contains layers that remain inaccessible to ordinary perception? These questions appear repeatedly across mythological traditions, religious narratives, and speculative fiction. Lovecraft's mythos does not answer such questions definitively. Instead, it transforms them into narrative possibilities. The Necronomicon may not exist, yet the idea of a forbidden manuscript continues to captivate readers. The city of R'lyeh remains fictional, yet the concept of hidden civilizations beneath the ocean appears regularly in speculative storytelling. And that enduring fascination points toward a larger cultural pattern. Fictional mythologies sometimes become cultural frameworks through which societies explore their deepest uncertainties. Lovecraft's cosmic horror does precisely that. It invites audiences to consider the unsettling possibility that human knowledge, however advanced, may still represent only a fragment of a much larger and stranger reality. Lovecraft's mythology presents a paradox for modern media. The stories revolve around entities that cannot be fully described and realities that defy ordinary perception. Yet visual and interactive media must show something. This tension has shaped the way Lovecraftian themes appear in film, video games, and music. Rather than attempting literal translation, creators often adapt the philosophical atmosphere of cosmic horror. The result is a body of cultural work that captures Lovecraft's ideas indirectly, emphasizing scale, ambiguity, and existential unease. Cinema offers one of the earliest examples of this adaptation challenge. Direct depictions of mythos creatures rarely succeed because Lovecraft intentionally designed them to resist visualization. Several filmmakers therefore approach cosmic horror through suggestion rather than explicit imagery. A notable example is The Thing, directed by John Carpenter. The film takes place in Antarctica, an environment strongly associated with At the Mountains of Madness. Although Carpenter's story involves an alien organism rather than Lovecraft's elder things, the atmosphere echoes mythos themes. Scientists uncover a buried extraterrestrial presence, and their attempts to understand it lead to paranoia and existential dread. The film's emphasis on isolation, biological transformation, and scientific uncertainty reflects the philosophical core of cosmic horror. Another influential cinematic example appears in Annihilation, directed by Alex Garland. The story explores a mysterious environmental phenomenon that alters biology, physics, and perception within a quarantined region known as the Shimmer. Researchers entering the zone encounter landscapes that defy ordinary explanation. Plants grow in impossible patterns, animals mutate unpredictably. Human memory itself becomes unstable. Although the film never references Lovecraft directly, its structure resembles mythos narratives. Scientific investigation gradually reveals a phenomenon operating beyond human conceptual frameworks. We must pause here to examine why these adaptations rarely focus on specific mythos entities. Visual media depends heavily on concrete imagery. Lovecraft's horror depends on conceptual uncertainty. If filmmakers present a creature with precise anatomical features, the audience quickly categorizes it as another monster. Cosmic horror therefore shifts attention away from individual beings and toward environmental transformation. Reality itself becomes the unsettling element. Video games provide a more flexible platform for Lovecraftian themes. Interactive storytelling allows players to experience the gradual discovery process that defines cosmic horror. One of the most significant examples is the tabletop role-playing system, Call of Cthulhu, first published in 1981. Players assume the roles of investigators researching strange events connected to mythos entities. The game introduces a unique mechanic known as sanity points. As characters encounter forbidden knowledge, their sanity decreases, reflecting the psychological collapse that appears throughout Lovecraft's fiction. This design demonstrates how interactive media can translate philosophical ideas into gameplay systems. Instead of defeating monsters through combat, players must manage the psychological consequences of discovery. Reading ancient manuscripts or witnessing cosmic entities often damages their characters' mental stability. The mechanic transforms Lovecraft's abstract concept of epistemic danger into a tangible rule governing gameplay. Modern video games expand this approach through environmental storytelling. Titles such as Bloodborne incorporate Lovecraftian motifs within complex narrative worlds. The game begins as a gothic horror scenario involving disease and religious corruption. Gradually, however, players uncover evidence of cosmic beings influencing the city's history. Ancient rituals, forbidden research, and alien entities reshape the narrative. The player's understanding of the world changes over time, mirroring the investigative structure found in Lovecraft's stories. Music represents another intriguing medium for cosmic horror adaptation. Certain experimental and metal genres explore Lovecraftian themes through atmosphere and lyrical imagery. Bands such as Metallica have referenced mythos ideas directly. Their instrumental track, The Call of Cthulhu, released in 1984, draws inspiration from Lovecraft's fictional entity. The composition emphasizes shifting tempos and ominous tonal structures, evoking a sense of approaching cosmic force. Other musicians interpret cosmic horror more abstractly. Ambient and experimental artists often create soundscapes designed to evoke immense spatial environments. Low-frequency drones, layered textures, and irregular rhythms suggest the vastness of cosmic space. These auditory environments mirror Lovecraft's literary descriptions of incomprehensible dimensions and ancient forces. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's influence on modern media rarely appears through direct adaptation alone. Instead, his ideas function as a conceptual vocabulary. Creators borrow themes such as ancient extraterrestrial civilizations, forbidden knowledge, and environmental transformation. These motifs appear across genres: science fiction, horror, fantasy, sometimes without explicit acknowledgement of their origin. Another reason for this persistence lies in the compatibility between cosmic horror and modern scientific speculation. Contemporary astrophysics frequently describes phenomena that resemble Lovecraftian imagery. Black holes distort space-time. Dark matter constitutes most of the universe's mass. The observable cosmos represents only a small fraction of a much larger system. Such discoveries naturally lend themselves to storytelling about human insignificance within immense cosmic processes. Modern media therefore continues exploring the same philosophical territory that fascinated Lovecraft a century ago. Each adaptation interprets the mythos through the technological and cultural tools of its era. Film emphasizes visual scale. Games emphasize investigative participation. Music emphasizes atmospheric immersion. And this cultural diffusion raises an interesting question. When cosmic horror spreads across multiple artistic forms, does it remain merely entertainment? Or does it begin functioning as a philosophical lens through which modern audiences interpret their relationship with the universe? As Lovecraft's mythology spread through literature and media, it gradually entered another arena: intellectual interpretation. Readers did not simply consume the stories as entertainment. They began analyzing the ideas behind them. Over time, the mythos developed two parallel afterlives. One emerged within academic scholarship, where researchers treated cosmic horror as a serious philosophical and literary subject. The other emerged within subcultures that adopted Lovecraftian imagery as a symbolic language for exploring existential questions. Both developments reveal how a fictional mythology can evolve into a broader cultural framework. Academic interest in Lovecraft expanded noticeably during the late 20th century. Earlier critics often dismissed his work as pulp fiction, focusing primarily on stylistic quirks or controversial personal views. By the 1980s and 1990s, however, literary scholars began re-examining his stories within the context of modern philosophy and science. Researchers recognized that cosmic horror addressed questions central to 20th century thought: the collapse of anthropocentrism, the destabilization of traditional cosmology, and the psychological consequences of confronting an indifferent universe. One influential thinker who engaged with these themes is Eugene Thacker, whose writings explore the philosophical implications of horror literature. Thacker argues that cosmic horror dramatizes what he calls the world without us. This phrase describes a philosophical perspective in which the universe exists independently of human meaning or perception. Lovecraft's stories illustrate that perspective through narrative form. Characters encounter environments, entities, and historical timelines that continue regardless of human awareness. The result is not merely frightening imagery, but a conceptual challenge to human-centered thinking. Another scholar frequently associated with Lovecraft studies is S.T. Joshi, whose extensive research into Lovecraft's life and writings helped establish the author as a significant figure in 20th century literature. Joshi's work emphasizes the philosophical coherence of cosmicism, the worldview underlying Lovecraft's fiction. According to this interpretation, the mythos represents a literary exploration of scientific materialism. The universe operates according to impersonal physical laws rather than moral intention. Humanity occupies a minor position within that system. We must pause here to consider why academic interest in cosmic horror intensified during the late 20th century. One explanation lies in developments within modern science. Astronomers increasingly describe a universe far larger and more complex than earlier generations imagined. Discoveries concerning black holes, dark matter, and cosmic background radiation expanded humanity's understanding of cosmic scale dramatically. Such discoveries resonate strongly with Lovecraft's central premise. Human knowledge reveals a universe that does not revolve around human concerns. While scholars explored the philosophical dimensions of the mythos, various subcultures embraced its symbolic imagery. fans of speculative fiction began forming communities dedicated to Lovecraftian storytelling. Conventions, online forums, and creative collaborations allowed participants to expand the mythology in new directions. These communities often treat the mythos less as a fixed narrative and more as a shared imaginative playground. Writers introduce new forbidden texts, artists design new cosmic entities, and readers debate interpretations of ancient fictional histories. The aesthetics of Lovecraftian horror have also influenced visual art, fashion, and design. Cryptic symbols, tentacled silhouettes, and imagined alien scripts appear in posters, clothing, and graphic novels. Such imagery functions almost like a cultural shorthand for existential unease. A simple glyph resembling a non-human alphabet can evoke the entire philosophical framework of cosmic horror. The visual style communicates ideas about forbidden knowledge and ancient civilizations without requiring extensive explanation. Another subcultural expression appears within tabletop gaming communities. Role-playing games inspired by Lovecraft often emphasize investigation, research, and intellectual discovery rather than traditional heroic adventure. Participants assume the roles of scholars uncovering fragments of cosmic truth. The gameplay experience mirrors the investigative structure of Lovecraft's narratives. Players gather clues, analyze artifacts, and gradually realize the scale of the mythos surrounding them. Consider this carefully. These communities are not merely reproducing Lovecraft's original stories. They are engaging with the underlying philosophy. Cosmic horror provides a language for discussing uncertainty about humanity's place in the universe. Participants explore ideas about ancient civilizations, hidden dimensions, and forbidden knowledge because those ideas symbolize deeper existential questions. Another intriguing development involves the intersection of Lovecraftian themes with contemporary philosophical movements. Some thinkers within speculative realism, a modern philosophical approach that questions human-centered views of reality, reference cosmic horror as an illustrative framework. The mythos dramatizes what speculative realists attempt to describe theoretically, a universe that exists independently of human perception. Yet these interpretations remain open-ended. Lovecraft's mythology does not dictate a single philosophical conclusion. Some readers interpret cosmic horror as an expression of pessimism about human significance. Others view it as an invitation to intellectual humility. If the universe is vast and complex beyond current understanding, curiosity may remain humanity's most valuable response. The continued presence of Lovecraftian imagery across academic and subcultural contexts suggests something important about the nature of myth itself. Myths often persist because they provide symbolic tools for thinking about difficult questions. Ancient cultures used mythological narratives to explore creation, morality, and cosmic order. Modern audiences sometimes use fictional mythologies to explore scientific and existential uncertainty. And this ongoing reinterpretation leads naturally to the final question surrounding Lovecraft's legacy. If cosmic horror continues to resonate across literature, philosophy, and popular culture, what psychological need does it fulfill? Why do audiences remain drawn to stories suggesting that humanity may not occupy the center of existence? The enduring power of Lovecraft's mythology does not depend on monsters, cults, or forbidden books alone. Its real influence lies deeper in the psychological and philosophical tension it introduces. Cosmic horror proposes a simple but destabilizing idea. Humanity may not occupy a privileged position in the universe. This suggestion was unsettling when Lovecraft wrote it during the early 20th century, and it remains unsettling today. Readers encountering the mythos are not merely absorbing fictional lore. They are confronting a worldview that quietly challenges human assumptions about meaning, significance, and knowledge. To understand why this concept persists, we must briefly revisit Lovecraft's philosophical framework. He described his outlook as cosmicism, a perspective grounded in scientific realism and existential indifference. According to this view, the universe operates through vast physical processes that do not recognize human values. Stars explode, civilizations vanish, and entire planetary histories unfold without moral intention. Lovecraft's fiction dramatizes this perspective through narrative encounters with ancient extraterrestrial entities and incomprehensible cosmic structures. Consider this carefully. The horror in cosmic horror is not that hostile creatures exist. The deeper implication is that the universe may not be organized around human experience at all. Lovecraft repeatedly described Earth as a temporary location within an immense cosmic timeline. Civilizations appear briefly, develop culture and science, and eventually disappear. In stories such as The Shadow Out of Time, the narrator realizes that humanity represents only one episode within a much longer planetary history. This perspective resonates strongly with modern scientific discoveries. During Lovecraft's lifetime, astronomy began revealing a universe vastly larger than earlier generations imagined. The discovery of galaxies beyond the Milky Way in 1924, confirmed by Edwin Hubble, expanded humanity's cosmic horizon dramatically. Instead of a single galaxy containing all stars, astronomers now recognized billions of galaxies scattered across unimaginable distances. Such revelations made humanity's cosmic position appear increasingly modest. Later discoveries intensified this shift in perspective. Observations of black holes, dark matter, and cosmic background radiation revealed a universe governed by physical processes far beyond everyday intuition. Modern cosmology estimates that visible matter constitutes only a small fraction of the universe's total mass energy content. Most of reality remains invisible and poorly understood. These scientific findings echo Lovecraft's fictional suggestion that humanity perceives only a narrow slice of cosmic reality. Psychologically, cosmic horror engages with a particular human fear, the fear of insignificance. Traditional mythologies often place humanity near the center of cosmic design. Religious narratives describe purposeful creation, moral order, and divine attention directed toward human behavior. Cosmic horror reverses this structure. Instead of a universe designed for humanity, Lovecraft imagines a universe that scarcely notices humanity's existence. We must pause here to recognize an important nuance. Cosmic horror does not necessarily claim that humans lack value. Rather, it suggests that the universe itself may not provide that value automatically. Meaning becomes a human project rather than a cosmic guarantee. Characters in Lovecraft's stories frequently collapse psychologically because they expect the universe to conform to human categories. When those expectations fail, their intellectual framework collapses. This tension connects cosmic horror to broader philosophical discussions about existentialism. Thinkers such as Albert Camus argued that humans live in a universe that does not inherently provide meaning. According to Camus, individuals must construct meaning through their actions rather than discovering it in cosmic design. Although Lovecraft and Camus approached the problem differently, both confronted the same fundamental question: how should humans respond to an indifferent universe? Interestingly, modern readers often interpret Lovecraft's cosmicism less pessimistically than earlier audiences did. Some find the concept strangely liberating. If humanity is not the center of existence, then intellectual exploration becomes an open-ended process rather than a search for predetermined answers. The vastness of the cosmos invites curiosity rather than despair. Knowledge expands not because the universe promises meaning, but because humans remain capable of asking questions. Another reason cosmic horror persists involves its narrative structure. Lovecraft rarely provides definitive explanations for the phenomena his characters encounter. The stories end with incomplete information, fragmented documents, and unresolved mysteries. This narrative strategy reflects the philosophical premise underlying the mythos. If reality extends beyond human comprehension, then any attempt to explain it completely will remain provisional. Such open-endedness allows cosmic horror to evolve across generations. New writers, filmmakers, and scholars reinterpret the mythos according to their own intellectual environments. Advances in astrophysics, artificial intelligence, and theoretical physics continually introduce new possibilities for imagining non-human intelligence or cosmic structures. Each generation encounters the same unsettling possibility Lovecraft explored a century ago. That reality may be far larger than human categories can comfortably contain. And this leads us to the final reflection. Cosmic horror endures because it occupies a boundary between fear and curiosity. It confronts readers with the unsettling idea that humanity's understanding of the universe remains incomplete, yet it also acknowledges something remarkable about the human mind. Even when faced with cosmic uncertainty, people continue investigating, questioning, and imagining. Perhaps that is the quiet paradox at the heart of Lovecraft's mythology. The universe may be vast, ancient, and indifferent, but the human impulse to explore it persists nonetheless.